Good morning. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Brian O'Donnell. I'm the Director of Campaign for Nature, and I'll be your moderator for this press briefing. We will be covering three fundamental aspects of the Global Biodiversity Framework this morning. First, the need for a target to effectively protect and conserve at least 30% of the world's lands and oceans. Second, the need for Indigenous peoples and local community rights to be safeguarded and advanced in that target, as well as throughout the entire framework. And third, the need for financing so that the framework is supported by adequate resources to be effectively implemented, and ensuring that enough of that financing reaches the ground to Indigenous peoples and local communities. Please note that this briefing is on the record. It's also being recorded, and the recording will be made available after the briefing. I'll briefly introduce today's speakers in speaking order. We'll be hearing from Mark Opel, Finance Lead for Campaign for Nature, Christiane Juliao of the Pancararu people, the Articulation of Indigenous Peoples of Brazil, which is APIB. She's also with the National Articulation of Indigenous Women, Ancestrality Warriors, ANMIGA, and the Global Alliance of Territorial Communities, GATC. And finally, we'll hear from Dr. Zachary Abdulhamid, Ambassador and Science Advisor for the Campaign for Nature. He's also the founding chair of IPBES, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. With that, we'll start with Mark Opel.
Thanks, Brian. Financing for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, or resource mobilization, as it's called in the negotiations, is critical. And the resource mobilization targets currently have more brackets than any others. As in prior COPs, for both climate and biodiversity, the hardest parts get left to the very end, and the money is always the hardest part. Negotiations on the numbers have not started, and tensions are currently running high, which is a sign that the negotiations are finally getting real. I'd like to talk for a minute about the numbers, and there are four key numbers in the Global Biodiversity Framework to keep in mind as the negotiations continue. The first is the overall global biodiversity funding gap, currently identified in Goal D, which has been estimated at $700 billion per year. The second key number is the dollar amount of reductions in subsidies harmful to nature that can contribute to closing that overall gap. $500 billion of subsidy reductions have been proposed in Target 18. The next target, Target 19.1, contains the third and fourth key numbers. The third key number is the target for the total global financial resources from all sources, domestic and international, public and private, needed to meet the goals of the GBF. $200 billion per year was in the first draft of the GBF, and some have proposed as much as 1% of global gross domestic product, which would be more than $800 billion per year. The fourth and final key number is the international biodiversity funding from developed countries to developing countries, which plays an outsized role in both the negotiations and in funding the actual implementation of the GBF. The first draft of the GBF had an increase of $10 billion in international financial flows over current levels, and current levels are in the range of $6 to $10 billion per year right now. We at Campaign for Nature and a group of other NGOs have called for at least $60 billion annually in international financial flows, and a group of developing countries have called for $100 billion annually. The mechanisms for the way this funding is channeled to developing countries has been a source of intense discussions, and those discussions are continuing. Campaign for Nature has provided a briefing that provides background information and more details on the numbers currently in brackets and the issues around resource mobilization, and we can point you to that briefing on our website. We and a group of 4 other NGOs have also produced the only report to date that provides real-time tracking of all the publicly announced pledges of international funding for biodiversity, and this tracker can be found at naturefinance.info, and we're happy to share that link as well. To date, we've tracked international funding pledges that currently total $7.2 billion per year, of which $6 billion is from governments, $900 million is from philanthropists, and $300 million is from businesses and investors. We expect more commitments to be announced this week. Finally, we think it's critical to understand these numbers as an investment and not a cost, an investment that generates positive economic impacts and reduces risks to our economies. This has been demonstrated by a range of studies, from the World Bank to the IMF to the World Economic Forum, McKinsey, Swiss Re, and a range of academic researchers from around the world. And specifically, investing in 30 by 30 delivers benefits that exceed the costs by at least 5 to 1. Links to all those studies and more can be found in the briefing I mentioned, and I'm happy to stick around to go into more details and answer any questions after this briefing. Back to you, Brian.
Thank you, Mark. As we prepared for this briefing, we note that the negotiations have really reached an impasse on the issue of finance. And so we thought putting all of those detailed numbers that Mark had in context and what could be done to overcome that are something that we wanted to share this morning. We've heard from donor countries that they're experiencing budgetary constraints related to inflation, near-term recessions being likely, the ongoing recovery from the pandemic, and global conflicts. That's understandable. But we have to keep in mind that this framework is over the course of the next decade. So we have to think that potentially the economic conditions will improve and financial outlooks will be more positive and more possible for increased financing. But in the immediate term, there's a very easy source for resources to come forward if political will is there. Keep in mind that the International Energy Agency reported that the net income from the world's oil and gas producers is set to double to $4 trillion in 2022. During the first 9 months of 2022, the 7 largest oil and gas companies reported profits of approximately $170 billion US. We also know that in 2021, the net profit of the 40 leading mining companies of the global mining industry was approximately $159 billion US. The majority of these profits are coming to companies that are located in developed and wealthy nations. So if we want to find a source for increased finance for biodiversity, it's simple. Let's place a windfall tax on those companies that have driven biodiversity loss, primarily the oil and gas companies and the mining companies. They have made massive profits in the last year. While the rest of the global economy has suffered, they are causing significant harm to biodiversity through direct on-the-ground impacts and through climate change, and it only makes sense that they be responsible for this. We're not talking about offsets. We're not talking about voluntary contributions. We're talking about governments requiring them to put this money. That can easily close a big portion of this biodiversity finance gap, and donor countries today should respond to that, their willingness to help close that gap through those sources of income. But I really want to also now move on to a critical component of the framework, and that is the rights of Indigenous peoples throughout the framework. We will now hear from Christiane Julião to talk about her experiences. She will be speaking in Portuguese, but we have a live translator, so you won't need your headphones. Christiane.
Bom dia, mulheres e não mulheres. Bem-vindos a esse momento único e muito importante para nós, povos indígenas do Brasil e de toda a América Latina.
Good morning, women and not women. Welcome to this unique moment that is very important for us indigenous peoples from Brazil and all over Latin America.
É chocante perceber aqui na COP sobre biodiversidade como os países não estão preocupados em resolver a questão da biodiversidade.
It's shocking to see how the countries that are here in COP15 are not worried to resolve the biodiversity crisis.
Não estão interessados em resolver a questão das mudanças climáticas.
They are not interested to solve the climate change issues.
Estão interessados em saber da onde vão continuar explorando.
They are just interested to know where they are continuing exploiting,
independente de quantas vidas estejam sendo sacrificadas.
independently of how many lives are being sacrificed.
Quando a gente fala em financiamento direto aos povos indígenas, estamos falando de autonomia dos povos indígenas também.
When you are talking about financing directly indigenous peoples, we are also talking about their autonomy.
Porque com esse recurso a gente vai investir na soberania e segurança alimentar e nutricional,
Because with this funding, we will invest in our food sovereignty,
na nossa saúde,
in our health,
na educação,
in our education,
segurança
safety,
e proteção ambiental para todo mundo.
and environmental protection that it's for everybody.
Os países precisam parar de terceirizar a responsabilidade sobre a gestão ambiental.
The countries need to stop to cope. The countries need to responsabilize themselves for the biodiversity crisis.
E é vergonhoso restringir apenas 1% como repassando benefício.
And it's shameless how they are putting to just include 1% for the sharing benefits.
Deveria ser a partir de 1%.
It should be from 1%.
Porque as questões territoriais são gigantes.
Because land issues are giant.
Vivemos sob constantes ameaças.
We live in constantly threat.
É garimpo,
It's legal mining,
mineração,
gold mining,
hidrelétricas,
hydropowers,
agronegócio,
agrobusiness,
chuvas de agrotóxico.
a lot of pesticides.
No Brasil são mais de 2.000 tipos. Dois tipos de agrotóxico.
In Brazil, we have like 2 types of pesticides.
E muitas doenças que antes a gente não tinha costume, agora tem que lidar com doenças cada vez mais agressivas.
And a lot of diseases that we were not used, but now it's more harmful for us.
Como o câncer.
How cancer.
E além da desnutrição.
And the lack of food.
Mas é interessante que a gente percebe que esse câncer de desnutrição que a gente sente no corpo, a gente também vê nos países esse câncer da ganância e a desnutrição afetiva.
And also this cancer that we feel in our bodies, we feel in the mind of the countries. And this lack, this desnutrition, disaffection, desnutrition, we see in the negotiations in the countries as well.
Então, por isso é importante a gente pensar em financiamento direto aos povos indígenas e comunidades locais.
Because of this, it's crucial to think about directly financing for indigenous peoples and local communities.
Para que os povos, para que nós mesmos possamos dizer como queremos gestar os nossos espaços.
Because then we can tell by ourselves how we want to manage our lands.
E promover o bem viver para todo mundo.
And promote the well-being, the wellness for everyone.
Obrigada.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. We'll now hear from Dr. Zachary Abdulhamid, who is the Ambassador and Science Advisor for Campaign for Nature. Also important to know that Zachary has been involved with the Convention on Biological Diversity since its very early days in the Rio Convention, and really helped bring the scientific community together as the founding chair of IPBES, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Dr. Zachary.
Thank you, Brian. I'm really pleased to be here today. And this is my 10th COP. And when I heard there was an impasse last night on the resource mobilization, I'm not worried. I know the negotiators will come together, and I hope they will work out something. And I hope what we would have at the end of this COP15 is a Paris moment and not a Copenhagen moment, as you know. But what I'd like to share with you today is really the role of science in the debate of coming up with a good post 2020 global biodiversity framework. And ladies and gentlemen, thanks to the tireless work of the scientific community, we understand the crisis facing the natural world better than ever before. Now, this knowledge does not give me despair. It gives me hope because decades of study have also clarified what the world must do. So, in light of the scientific evidence, parties have rightly identified 30 by 30 as the centerpiece of these negotiations. And Canadian Minister Stephen Gubo, that's how you pronounce it. I'm from Malaysia, so I don't know how to pronounce it rightly, has rightly equated it to the 1.5 degree target for the climate convention. And overwhelming scientific research has shown that we must protect at least 30% on land and at least 30% in the global ocean to effectively respond to the biodiversity crisis. Of course, if you listen to one of the fathers of biodiversity, E.O. Wilson, he would argue that we need 50% of the globe to be protected. So 30% is the minimum, and there are several, in fact, many scientific studies that support that. One is the Waldron report published in 2020, who argued for the 30 by 30, and also the economic case of conservation. Then there's the Dasgupta review, I think it's in 2021, that shows that there are economic benefits again about conservation. So recently, the IPCC also found that we must protect at least 30% of the planet to help achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. Ladies and gentlemen, let me be very clear. 30% is the minimum. The science also makes it clear that where and how we protect these areas is essential. We must focus on the areas most important to biodiversity. We must focus on connectivity and ecological representativity, and we must focus on ensuring the right outcomes. I know you all are aware that roughly 17% of the world's land and 8% of the ocean has been conserved to date. But not all these changes are delivering their intended outcomes, and this must change. Ladies and gentlemen, achieving the 30 by 30 will rely on a full array of management paradigms, from highly and fully marine protected areas to other effective conservation measures and indigenous conserved territories. Also, it would require dramatically increased funding for new as well as existing conserved areas. And you have heard some of those figures that Mark just explained. So, to conclude, I believe that we have a momentous opportunity in front of us. To make the most of it, parties must finalize an agreement on 30 by 30 that gets the quantitative and qualitative details right and ensures that we act with the ambition that science tell us what is required. And also, I just want to impress here upon the role of the science policy interface. That has not been very clear when the CBD was signed in Rio in 1992. We do have SubStar, the subsidiary body on scientific, technical, and technological knowledge, but eventually the science element were augmented or supplemented by IPBES, the intergovernmental platform on biod and ecosystem services. So the science is there. All we need to do now is to convince our policymakers and in particular our political leaders. What is missing here, ladies and gentlemen, is the political will and also honest, honest agreement what needs to be done. We kept saying this. In fact, I was an IPBES founding chair when the 2019 report came out with 1 million species of plants and animals is under threat of extinction. I'm not sure how much that goes down, to all of us. I suspect because, yes, 1 million is under threat, but are we under threat? Look at us in this room, we can give all the figures, and argue all the political points, but life is still comfortable. So, Brian, I would appeal to all of you and also the delegates in this COP15 to make sure that let it be known that CBD is not the ugly duckling, as some people were saying. All right? We need to have that aspiration. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Zachary. We've heard now the importance of finance. We know that finance not only needs to be increased, but it needs to go to the right places, including the communities and the indigenous peoples on the front lines. We've heard about the importance that rights be upheld, and we've heard about the importance of an at least 30 by 30 target. We'll now open for questions. We only have a few minutes, but I do want to let people know that we will all be available afterwards if we have to yield the stage. I think in the front row here at the...
Hi, Emilia Fournier, APTN National News. Am I able to ask a question to Christian?
Yes, we'll go through the translator here.
So in Canada, there's an initiative to have Indigenous protected and conserved areas. I'm wondering if there's any kind of equivalent of that in Brazil. And if there isn't, are you hoping that that is something that with the new president coming in 2023 that might happen?
A gente, no Brasil, tem a diferença de que o Brasil não quer reconhecer os territórios indígenas. Desculpa, não vá.
The issue is that in Brazil, they don't want to recognize the indigenous lands,
Isso independe de governo.
independently of what government is seated there.
Foi muita resistência até, por exemplo, até o ano de 1973, com a lei que chama Estatuto do Índio, que lá temporiza, no prazo de 5 anos, reconhecer todas as terras indígenas, o que não aconteceu.
There was a lot of resistance since 1973. That was an indigenous statute in Brazil that recognized that all indigenous land territories should be identified and recognized for 5 years. But this didn't happen.
A Constituição de 88 reafirma, traz essa mesma leitura, que em 5 anos também, mesma coisa, ia reconhecer os territórios indígenas.
The 1988 Federal Constitution from Brazil also recognized that indigenous lands should be recognized, legally recognized, from 5 years. So all indigenous territories should be demarcated till 1993, and this didn't happen as well.
Assim, a gente não tem uma política que realmente queira a regularização territorial. A gente tem uma das lutas territoriais que está acontecendo no Supremo Tribunal Federal, que é da terra indígena, do povo Xoclém, Santa Catarina. Não vou nem saber, né? Mas vou dizer. É de um povo indígena, povo Xoclém, Santa Catarina, que o governo tem apelado para o marco temporal.
So what is missing also in Brazil, independently of the government, it's political will. And also there is a discussion in Federal Supreme Court in Brazil that states the temporal framework that regards for one indigenous territories, the indigenous land Xoclém, that in the temporal framework says that if the indigenous peoples were not in the lands in 1988, so the land should not be demarcated, that should not be recognized.
E a gente não consegue avançar. Então, tem muita terra para ser demarcada. Não é muita terra para pouco índio, não. Tem muito indígena sem terra.
So we cannot advance in these issues in Brazil. And there is a say in Brazil that there is too many indigenous people.
A ideia não é muita terra para pouco índio. É o contrário.
Sim. There is a saying in Brazil that say there are lots of indigenous lands for few people, for indigenous peoples, but actually it's the opposite. There are lots of indigenous peoples without lands in Brazil.
Thank you. Another question here in the front on the left.
Emilio Godoy, Interpress Service and Earth Journalism Network. What are viable options so that indigenous peoples receive direct financing for biodiversity and not suffering the delays that we've seen in climate financing, that there are promises and offers, but they take time to reach the ground for local communities and indigenous peoples? What are your proposals for that and not repeating the same mistake than climate financing? Thank you.
I can start, or Mark, and then we can go to Christian. First of all, in Target 19, in the framework, there is a discussion about how much money is putting forward for biodiversity, but currently in brackets, there is a suggestion that says, and that money should go not just to governments, but to indigenous peoples and local communities. So those brackets need to be removed. If we are to see money from this framework go to indigenous peoples and local communities, we strongly support that Target 19 includes language specifically saying that a substantial portion of that money must go to indigenous peoples and local communities. And so that's one first step. Of course, then the modalities of that, the mechanisms need to be developed, because currently the financial mechanisms are not fit for purpose. They're used to giving to governments, they're used to giving to NGOs, but they are not used to giving to local communities. So we need a full-scale change in the mechanism, the plumbing, if you will, of financing, so that international biodiversity finance flows can effectively reach indigenous peoples and local communities.
Realmente, aqui nessa Copa, a gente tem que investir tanto colchete que é pior que conselheiro.
In this COP, we are seeing so many brackets, so many practices that is very difficult to continue.
Mas a melhor forma de financiar é diretamente com as organizações indígenas.
The best way should be financing directly to the indigenous organizations.
Todos os territórios que conformam a Aliança Global, nós somos 5 organizações. Tem a PIB, a MAN, a Repaliac, COICA e a MPB. Dessas organizações, cada país que contempla que está inserido nessa articulação tem várias organizações. Por exemplo, a PIB, nós somos 7 organizações regionais, e dessas 7 vai se ampliando, porque vem dos territórios.
So we are lots of indigenous organizations. Like I'm here also as part of the Global Alliance of Territorial Communities that is formed by other 5 organizations from different countries, as APIB from Brazil, COICA from Amazon Basin, AMPB from Mesoamerica, Repaliac for Congo Basin, and also MM from Indonesia. And all of these organizations has their grassroots organizations. Like in Brazil, APIB has other 7 indigenous organizations. So we have like a structure, a governance structure, and we are ready to work with this financing.
And on that, our time has expired here, so we need to turn this over to the next panel, and we'll be available for questions in the audience. But thank you for coming and for your questions and participation.